February of 2019, legislators in Hong Kong introduced a law that would allow criminals to be extradited to mainland China. The bill caused people to worry that this would provide China with a backdoor into influencing Hong Kong's legal system and function as a tool to extract political dissidents. Come March of that year, people began taking to the street to protest, and by June, those protests had exploded in size, regularly drawing hundreds of thousands of people into the street, which is a pretty appreciable percentage of Hong Kong's population. Not only were the protests largely allowed to take place, they seem to have worked. The bill was suspended on June 15th and further declared dead by July 9th. Protests continued, however, aiming to have the bill formally withdrawn and Hong Kong's chief executive resign. But on July 23rd, the protests were no longer tolerated. Roughly 100 masked men wearing white t-shirts began beating protesters and others indiscriminately. The Hong Kong police force was largely inactive. There were even reports that they would hang up on people trying to call the assaults in. There's evidence that these individuals were operating at the behest of the government in Beijing. And on the day that I started filming this, Chinese officials warned against future protests by claiming that the protesters had exceeded their right to free assembly. So by and large, these protests were allowed to take place until they weren't, and violently so. And since the last few weeks have also seen large-scale protests in Russia, Puerto Rico, the Czech Republic, it got me really wondering, when do states repress protest activity as opposed to allowing it to happen? And why? So as you can probably imagine, there are just these huge literatures on social movements and repression in sociology, history, political science, anthropology. There's no way I'm going to be able to cover all of it in the length of a YouTube video. I mean, unless we're okay with this being as long as one of those, the B movie, but every frame with a B in it, the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy is played kind of deals. So we're going to pull back, and instead of grappling with the minutia, try to understand it from a more abstract and general position. And actually, with that in mind, it might be easier to start with the why before moving on to the when. One obvious answer is that this is a practice that will occur almost exclusively in autocratic states. After all, the ability to assemble and peacefully protest is generally regarded as being a mainstay of little L liberal democracy, something that autocracies, by definition, aren't. Additionally, it seems logical to think that autocracies would have the most to lose in permitting protests to take place. Autocratic regimes rely on the compliance of the people to permit the kinds of graft and corruption that allow the leader to remain on top. Plus, protests are often aimed, at least ostensibly, towards enhancing the standing and living standards of the population writ large, often at the expense of the autocrat's power, sometime at the expense of the whole autocratic system of government. Shoot, that's how we got the Arab Spring. The intuition is correct, but only to a point. Autocracies are more likely to engage in protest suppression, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence. Plenty of democracies do this as well. Remember what happened with the protesters in Spain over the attempted Catalonian separation referendum? Or how about the violent suppression of civil rights and anti-war rallies in the US in the 60s and 70s? Democracies have engaged in their own fair share of protest-related shadiness. So if it's not determined by the rights supposedly protected by the system of government, why do states suppress protests? It has to be some factor that's shared by both autocratic and democratic regimes, but felt more keenly in autocracies to account for the fact that it's experienced more there. That factor, according to the research, is actually something we briefly touched on a second ago. Regime threat. Regimes that feel that their stability or existence is threatened are going to be far more likely to engage in protest suppression. As Jennifer Earle wrote in 2011's Annual Review of Sociology, the most compelling finding has been that threat is critically important to explaining repression protests across time, place, and form of analysis. Put simply, the more a movement or a protest threatens authorities, the more likely it is to face repression. A really interesting example of this comes from China. It's pretty well known that the Chinese state monitors its citizens' social media activity. And again, from the Arab Spring and recent protests in the Czech Republic, we know that social media offers a powerful means of protest organization and, consequently, a threat to regimes. So we would rationally expect that people posting negative comments about the Chinese state would have their views censored. And when researchers Gary King, Jennifer Pan, and Margaret Rogers investigated it by tracking online activity on 1,400 different Chinese social media sites, they found that writing negative things about the Communist Party was not a significant predictor of whether a post was eventually censored. That's kind of counterintuitive, but the reason why it's the case demonstrates this really critical point. The decision of when and how to repress activity is conditioned on a few very important factors. In the case of China, King, Pan, and Rogers followed up with a really clever experiment. They made loads of posts on Chinese social media sites that varied on two main dimensions: if the post was supportive or critical of the Chinese state, and if the post directly tried to inspire real-world activity. What they found was that negative posts were often allowed to go through uncensored, provided that the posts weren't trying to encourage any follow-up action in reality. In fact, even pro-regime posts weren't allowed if the text encouraged gathering and demonstrations in the real world. China was willing to allow some form of regime threat, critical opinions, but were more restrictive on other forms of threat, real-world mobilization. Similarly, China allowed some form of regime threat, the early protests, but disallowed them later when they were trying to kill the bill permanently and remove a congenial chief executive. Although there haven't been any specific case studies or further scientific research explicitly linking these events to what I'm about to say, these examples cohere with a vein of the literature that argues that a big limiting factor are the costs of repression. In an ideal world, or at least ideal from the perspective of a dystopian state, the optimal thing would be to censor all the thoughts, statements, and actions of people seriously critical of the regime. Something like how the state stamps out dissent through policing and propaganda in 1984. But in reality, making sure that every single rebellious sentiment is quashed is ludicrously expensive. You have to mobilize people to do the policing, arm them with the resources to enact the repression, make sure that it's widespread enough that the threat against collective action is actually credible. And it's not even just money that's the issue, but overall state capacity. Many nations don't have the resources to engage in that kind of policing. People are too spread out. The tendrils of government can't always reach the furthest extent of the nation's borders. There are lots of things preventing this dystopian ideal from happening. And it's not even just the costs of attempting the action that restrains the state, it's also the costs that come after. States that overtly try to stomp out repression often face a reputational cost from the rest of the world. Other nations and multinational companies don't want to do business with a place that's seen as unstable and illiberal, unless of course, the economy of that place is just too huge to ignore, like in the case of China. But this reticence can cost these states in terms of aid money and foreign direct investment, all really important sources of revenue for these regimes. However, if the protests are being mobilized by the political opposition, it might be too costly for them to ignore it. Sometimes doing nothing implies that they don't think it's a serious threat, but also doing nothing could mean that they don't have the strength to be able to do something about it. The latter is something that the states desperately try to avoid appearing like. So when protests arise, regimes undergo a kind of cost-benefit analysis based on the degree of risk the actions actually have and their abilities to be able to deal with them. This cost-benefit analysis actually goes a long way in explaining how repression is enacted too. Take the case of the Hong Kong protesters again. Research by Lynette Ong makes a pretty compelling argument for why states would want to hire outside thugs to attack protesters as opposed to doing so themselves. It adds a degree of separation between the state and the repression, as well as a kind of veil of plausible deniability. And it can actually be a bit of a cheaper form of repression in nations that don't have the state capacity to use the military or police powers for that purpose. In fact, this exact tactic has been deployed in Egypt, Syria, Russia, Malaysia, and actually in Hong Kong in the past. The cost-benefit analysis also helps determine whether or not they even use violence. It sounds like a depressingly simple choice, but it actually depends on a myriad of other factors. If they have more control over the press than not, then the state might be able to permit infrequent or minor protests by simply directing that entity to not get it covered, or at the very least minimize or spin it in the state's favor. This and other structural considerations allows nations to engage in repression without resorting to full-on, dramatic, and highly visible violence. Like so many other things in the social sciences, you're not going to get a set of specific conditions for when states engage in protest. It's not like you can say on the 5th protest, if the protesters make this kind of demand in this country, there is an X% chance that violent repression will occur and that it'll be successful. That's some foundation level stuff right there, and we'll realistically never be able to make those kinds of assessments. But we can understand the broader mechanisms. States and their leaders like to maintain their grip on power. When threats to that grip are serious and when the costs of action and fallout are relatively low, you can expect them to engage in suppression at least far more often than when threats are less serious and or more costly. And when you pair this knowledge with a deeper understanding of the context and nations that you're seeing on the news, it helps give a better sense of when nations let their people's voices be heard versus when, they don't. I'm curious to see what you guys think about all of this. Do y'all buy the general argument that threat is the predominant factor here? What other factors aside from that might be responsible? Do you think that we're seeing more repression in ostensibly democratic societies now than we have previously? Are we seeing less? Why do we see it either way? I'm curious to see what your guys' thoughts about that, other thoughts that cropped up watching this video, or suggestions for future topics down in the comment section below. And I'm looking forward to reading all of them and answering a few in the next office hours. Special thanks to those supporting Professor Politics on Patreon. I'd like to give a special shout out to research assistants Sam, Dealey, and Noel. Patrons get exclusive content, early content, and shoutouts. And if you're able to help, there's a link down in the description below, as well as the end card of this video. I truly appreciate it. Sources for everything is always be down in the doobly-doo, as well as links to the socials and the blog. I look forward to seeing you guys up there as well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, by subscribing to the channel, stay in the loop for more awesome social science content is uploaded. If you want to be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video, be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.